All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jonathan Wyrtzen. I'm serving right now as the acting chair of the Council on Middle East Studies. Before we start today's talk, I wanted to join with the rest of the Yale community, and I know many people elsewhere here in the US and around the world, in marking a moment of silence on the year anniversary of the announcement of the COVID pandemic and the way that that began to hit our communities. And so we're remembering those we've lost. We've remembered those the suffering and the other various forms of loss in this time. So we'll take 1 minute of silence to mark that. We'll turn now to the real delight that we have. I mean, somewhat this is a result of the pandemic, is to be able to invite scholars and to bring together community in the audience through these series that is possible across distances. And so today I really have the delight of welcoming Natalie Koch. She's associate professor of geography at the Maxwell School up at Syracuse University. And she is the author of multiple works. I encourage you to look at the variety of projects that she's been involved in that have encompassed a book project on critical geographies of sport, another one on the geopolitics of spectacle. And that was I think she'll probably give us more information on this too, but geographically, she has also done a lot of work in Central Asia. Today, she's going to be talking about her new work that's been focusing on the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. And so it's, as the council, we're really pleased to have you here, Natalie, and really excited about the presentation they make on this new project and the really creative and the comparative perspective that you're bringing on Saudi Arabia and Arizona. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Just one prior kind of just a word about the process. If you're new to us, we'll have about 45 minutes or 45 minutes that Natalie will present, and then we'll open up the Q&A. And so you can look for that. You'll get prompted. But as you're listening, you can also be thinking the types of questions, and then I'll be presenting those and allowing Natalie to respond at the end. And we'll wrap up at about 1 p.m. So thanks so much, Natalie.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you also to Vish, Kristen, and Marwa for their help in coordinating and making this possible today. Thanks also to Beth Derderian, who was a fellow last year, who gave me the initial invitation to come, and we are now finally making it happen. So I'm going to share my screen here for you all. And yeah, so this is a very large project. I didn't expect it to become such a large project. And it started with the idea of thinking comparatively about deserts. How are different deserts of the world connected? And I'm originally from Arizona. I grew up in Arizona. As Jonathan mentioned, I spent a lot of time working in Central Asia, and there I also sort of noticed the desert themes, and thinking about deserts critically was something that I was always doing, but I never framed my research in those terms. So this project I was initially conceptualizing as looking at connections between the US Southwest, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central Asia. The Arabian Peninsula, Arizona piece just got really big, and so I focused there, and then I started to develop a series of case studies. Of those case studies, I'm working on Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE. Today, I'll just talk about the Saudi case study, which is actually the piece that had stuck with me from the very beginning and got me really interested in pursuing this direction. So as you can see from this particular image, there is quite an interesting set of symbols in the way that different deserts are connected and narrated as connected that really came to my attention in 2016 when it was announced that the Saudi dairy company had purchased a large amount of farmland in Arizona. And the news itself was interesting to me for various reasons related to where I'm from and my research in the Arabian Peninsula, but also, as you can tell from these images, the Orientalism that infused almost all of the media narratives about the Saudi acquisition of this farmland. And these images here come from Phoenix Magazine, and the way that was discussed wasn't entirely isolated. So the farm, just a quick introduction to this particular space that they're talking about here. These images show where it is located, really in the middle of the desert, in just an area, Vicksburg, which is west of Phoenix, Arizona. And as you can see from the top drone satellite photo that we took in 2019, they are growing alfalfa primarily. That's what they are growing there. And then there are some cattle that are on site as well. But primarily what they're growing is feed for the dairy industry, which is getting shipped back to Saudi Arabia from Arizona. So, as I said, the narratives and the anxieties about the Saudi acquisition of the farmland was really quite profound in any of the media that actually covered the issue, and you can see that that dominant sort of anxiety about U.S. Southwest and its water gets built into how this is interpreted. I'll also just make a quick footnote here that there is also an Emirati farm right nearby, but the press coverage might mention that at times. By and large, though, the focus, the attention within the U.S. media and elsewhere has been on the Saudi investment, and this sort of speaks to the way that Saudi Arabia, as an imagined geographic entity, is such a lightning rod within the United States. So, as I said, I leave aside the Emirati story, but that's another case that I have been researching as well. So a lot of that anxiety has been tied to water grabbing or land grabbing, this bigger story that you may have encountered before, and that idea of a land grab is really kind of put to this grain report that comes from 2008, and that term sort of gained international recognition and started to proliferate in uses. And so, as you can see from this particular image here, the idea is that there's like outsiders, elites, because they're wearing suit jackets there, that are coming and they're stealing the land. They're taking the land from the local people who are, farming that. And this image is really powerful and it's really evocative, and just that term land grab, it communicates quite a lot in very little. And that, to me, is precisely the problem with this approach, with this line of investigation. It doesn't actually ask, who are those hands? Like, they're completely disembodied hands. And so the questions for me are really, who are those hands? Who is coming and buying this land? What are they doing? What are the political economic networks that facilitate that acquisition of land? That to me is what an embodied critical geographic perspective needs to bring to these questions about foreign farmland acquisitions. So that said, the mainstream sort of social science literature has still picked up this idea of the land grab, and as you can tell from one of the books in the middle, the sort of trying to get beyond the hype at times, but nonetheless using this language of the land grab, and immediately pitting a sort of us against them storyline here. This has parallels within the water grabbing narrative or virtual water, where outside actors are coming to farm in a particular place, and because they're farming and they're sucking the water to irrigate those fields, that becomes virtual water when the grain and other food products are shipped overseas. So these sort of storylines are quite dominant, I would say, in the way that these land acquisitions have been treated. For me, I'm trying to get beyond that. And to get beyond that, I think you really have to pay attention to the political economy of what these relationships are built on, broader histories of food geopolitics and history in general. And so how I do that in this research is specifically looking at a number of actors. One is, well, who is actually buying that land in Arizona? It's almost uniformly framed in Arizona as the Saudis are doing this. The Saudis are coming. The Saudis are X, Y, or Z. That narrative is common, but who are the Saudis? That question is rarely actually asked. So in this particular case, we have this dairy company, Almarai, which is the largest dairy company in Saudi Arabia and indeed the Middle East, which is the owner of that land. They have subsidiaries which go out about in various places and purchase the land. So it's a subsidiary of Almarai that owns that farm in Arizona. So they have various sort of locations around the world. Their farms are kind of shifting regularly, but in the United States, they have two sites, the farm in Arizona, and then one that's only about 45 minutes to an hour drive away in Blythe, California. And you can see that, that this is something that they kind of are open about, but it's not something that they want to call that much attention to. So I'll come back to this map in a little bit, but I want to go hone in on one particular site here on this map, which is Kharj. Kharj is where Almarai is headquartered. And as I started to look more and more into this project, I learned that Kharj actually also has a much longer history and ties to Arizona and to sort of farming techniques in that exchange around farming techniques with the US Southwest dating back to the 1940s. So I've been looking at this particular case study as something about the contemporary connections, but also the historical connections. So I'm looking about the ties between Arizona and Saudi Arabia across space, but across time as well. And where we can really begin to place some of these connections between Arizona in particular is with the work of Carl S. Twitchell. So anybody who's sort of read anything about the history of Saudi Arabia probably has read something about Carl Twitchell, or you maybe have visited his archives in Princeton. So Twitchell became a royal advisor to Saudi kings in, like, he first got over there. Very quickly, he started to serve as an advisor. In 1942, he convinced the US government to help support one of the very first agricultural mission, which you see the report on here in this in this opening part of the text. And so he, as you can see also from the left-hand side of the image, he and a couple of other men had basically trekked through Saudi Arabia, and the idea of this agricultural mission was for them to map the agricultural and water situation in Saudi Arabia. And so the lines, the kind of yellow lines there, indicate where they traveled throughout Saudi Arabia for this visit. So this was funded by the US government. He had argued to the US government, basically anybody who would listen, that US relations could really be built on, built with Saudi Arabia on the basis of trying to help them promote agriculture. Twitchell knew, as a royal advisor, that this was a point of anxiety for the Saudis. And so he thought, okay, if we can help them with this particular issue, this will build all sorts of goodwill. And, some of those other benefits, like of fostering a positive image of the United States and building political allegiances, and of course the capitalist profits that can come from all of that, importing technology and farm equipment, other things like that that had knock-on effects for many years. So for Twitchell was a major advocate of this modernizing agenda, but he also knew that there was an interest, a receptiveness among the Saudi elites to this program. And so this was something that he already knew even before the Ag Mission in 1942, but then the Ag Mission gives a little bit more ground to that. Two major results sort of come of this Ag Mission, which I'll talk about today. One is that after that report came out, the Twitchell really sort of wanted to push to continue this relationship, and so he pushed to have a team of farmers come to Saudi Arabia to help develop agricultural developments in Kharj. I'll come back to that in a minute. And so he got the U.S. to support sending David Rogers and a team of farmers to Saudi Arabia to work on Kharj. Rogers is from Arizona, and this is something that is constantly in all the archival documents and anything that you actually will encounter about Kharj and the Rogers mission. They emphasize that he's from Arizona. So his sort of agricultural expertise in the Arizona desert becomes a very important tool in how they are justifying this particular project and the special expertise that these Americans have in going over there. So the desert and the US Southwest becomes part of that bigger story about connection. The other sort of outcome of this early mission is that then the Saudis are invited to come to Arizona to tour agriculture in Arizona as well. And so they can get sort of firsthand experience with this. So Prince Faisal and Khalid are sent to Arizona in 1943, and they are going ostensibly to tour different sites related to agriculture. I can find very little about this particular visit, but of the documents that I have been able to find, they sort of talk about they go to Grand Canyon and they look at some sheep. There was an interest in sheep raising, particularly from the Navajo, that they wanted to develop some sheep cultivation practices in Saudi Arabia. So this visit is kind of underplayed, as we'll see, compared to a later visit. But this is kind of beginning the idea that the Saudis can come to Arizona and they can learn from us. They can learn about our water and they can learn about our agriculture and then bring that back to develop and modernize Saudi Arabia's agriculture itself. But more specifically, the efforts really kind of get concentrated at Kharj, which, as you can see from this one map here, just outside of Riyadh, and this team of led by David Rogers and some of his high school friends who are all in soil conservation. He gets sent to Kharj in 1944. They stay for about 18 months and help develop various fields in the area. This is another map. Again, these are maps that are difficult to come by, but this one is from a geography article from 1951, where you can see that the American developments, this is where the Rogers team was kind of concentrating their efforts, was dedicated to trying to plant and to get primarily alfalfa and wheat and other types of vegetables developed in the area. And one of the important reasons that they go to Kharj in particular is that there's well-established water reserves in the area. And this is something that I've learned about primarily from one of my department predecessors, that all of this is sort of coming after I started to investigate this. I was reading this old geography article from him, George Babcock Cressy. He was a professor in my department in the basically from like the 1930s until he died in the 1960s. And so in this article, he talks about the water holdings in the Al-Kharj area, and you can have some of these remarkable images from Al-Kharj in the Syracuse University archives from his travels. These are slides which have been digitized, but as you can see from the image on the right on the bottom, Al-Kharj had the series of sinkholes. And so it was quite easy to get the water from these large sinkholes, and it was quite accessible as compared to other places around Saudi Arabia that water was not as easily accessed. So that this was the main reason that they kind of targeted Al-Kharj, or one of the main reasons that they targeted Al-Kharj for these initial sort of pilot projects with Saudi agriculture. And this was, supposed to be demonstration of the ability of modern technology to grow and develop things like wheat and alfalfa, which are water intensive crops in the middle of the Saudi desert. So this idea of water accessibility is quite important. And as you can see also from the bottom, this is kind of this title for the image on the left that is in this earlier article from Cressy, that there's this narrative of transforming a wasteland. And I have a separate part of this project, which is looking specifically at that wasteland narrative and how the Americans were going to come in and transform the wasteland through smart use of water. So as I mentioned, other sorts of things were quite popular as well, but beyond just the wheat and alfalfa, you had vegetable production. The watermelons were a popular item as well, and these sort of, became a selling point for the project. That look, we can grow anything if we can grow watermelons in the desert here. So one of the important things about Al-Kharj, and I mentioned before, one of the reasons that they targeted Al-Kharj is that this was a favorite royal location. So the various kings over time, from Ibn Saud down to King Saud himself after that, they had kind of royal retreats in Al-Kharj, and so this was a place that they would go. And they also kept the royal horses in this area. So the vast majority of the wheat and alfalfa were going to feed the royal horses, but also even these vegetables that we see here. This was basically the vast majority of the food production that was happening at Al-Kharj was going to feed the royal family in Riyadh. So that was the primary purpose of this kind of production. It was narrated by the Americans as a pilot, as something that was going to showcase all of these, possibilities for agriculture in the area. But really, it was being used also to help the king feed the royal family in Riyadh, as well as the royal horses. Soon cows come along, and for that we need to take another little detour back to Arizona, because the cows were not initially a part of the Al-Kharj developments, and they were actually not part of that effort of the Rogers team in 1944 and 45. They come somewhat later. And this is when, at that time, Crown Prince Saud Al Saud goes to Arizona, and this one, in contrast to the previous visit in 1943, was a much bigger deal in the press. And you can see that how it was treated in the press is quite extensive. There's lots and lots of coverage, and so these images are coming from Arizona State University's documents from the visit. And the Saudi group, they went to Boulder Dam, which actually people now know probably as Hoover Dam. They went to tour this. This was part of, again, that same story of the Saudis need to come to Arizona to learn about how we manage water in the desert. And at that time, the Hoover Dam was such an important spectacle of American modernity and hydro expertise that they were trying to advertise. the Crown Prince's entourage also was just kind of touring a bunch of fields, checking out the fields, and looking at how irrigation was working in various places. And so they went all around the state doing that. They were also wined and dined by the various Arizona elites or leaders, however you want to put that term. And you know, they sort of all came together to show that Arizona was a place of modernity as well. And so this was a big part of the Arizona sort of branding of their own technological expertise in taming the desert. But what I so love about this particular visit of Crown Prince Saud at the time is kind of encapsulated in this image, which actually was not in Arizona, but just this idea that these relations between Saudi leaders and the U.S. government and U.S. officials is not just about oil and arms, right? And I think that kind of reductionist trope about how we approach and understand Saudi-U.S. relations today actually has much more diverse angles to it, and just the hearty laughter over this rooster is an indication of that these relations are much more diverse. And I think once we start to attend to how diverse they are, we can open up new angles and questions on how U.S.-Saudi relations are unfolding. So kind of from we actually go back to the laughter here. One of the articles that I read in the Arizona newspapers talked about how Crown Prince Saud was particularly impressed by the cows. And so they went to a number of different dairy farms and cattle ranches and other things like this. And he, you know, was particularly pleased when he asked them to wrangle a calf. And so people, you know, sort of put on this display for him. So he comes back to Saudi Arabia with an interest in cattle production and in dairy in particular. So it is sort of after this time period that he pushes, at that time, Aramco has taken over the farm again. He pushes the Aramco leaders of the Kharj farm to help develop dairy in the area. So they start with 1, then it becomes 2, then it becomes 3. So Kharj becomes kind of the home of Saudi Arabia's first dairy industry and development, and this is something that continues. So for anybody who knows anything about cows eat a lot. They demand a lot of water, but primarily the water demand to sustain a dairy industry is coming from the feed. And this is something that also kind of went hand in hand with a number of other developments in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s around promoting agriculture and promoting crops like wheat and alfalfa, which are used as feed for the dairy. So I won't spend too much time on this section because there's a lot of details here, and I don't have that much time. So just in a very short version, in the 1970s, there is sort of this world food crisis, which then coincides with the oil crisis and US government threatening an embargo on grain and other foodstuffs going to Saudi Arabia. This would have been unenforceable. This was simply a rhetorical threat, but it sort of raised this as an issue, as a specter within the Arabian Peninsula, such that local leaders kind of needed to, you know, they needed to show that they were paying attention and that they were considering their own food security in the wake of these threats, and then the food crisis and other issues. And so it became increasingly important for them to demonstrate that. One of the ways that they demonstrated that was by introducing a number of new agricultural subsidies to help promote local production of grains and foodstuffs. So this has really kind of become this sort of seen described as in some of the literature as a boom, but this was an oil boom, right? This was an agricultural boom where the farmers are getting large subsidies. per usual with a lot of these big subsidy regimes, that this is not going to bolster small scale farmers. This is going to bolster elites who can take advantage of these regimes and eventually consolidate power. So this sort of consolidation of Saudi agriculture also happens during this time. And big dairy thrives. Almarai is one of the beneficiaries of the sort of successor of a number of these policies. So they mentioned, I have to be brief on this piece, but the two books on the side here, Adam Hania's book and Eckhard Wyrtzen's book, really go into the details of this for anyone who is interested, and they're really, really fantastic. So coming out of this is sort of elite concentration of agricultural power, is that dairy becomes important. And this one article from 2013 from CNN talks about, that these dairies are thriving. And often this is sort of attributed just to oil wealth, right? That they have the money to subsidize this. And that is something that they can continue to do just because they've got the oil money and they can continue to pay for something that maybe is ecologically and financially not a logical decision. The other piece of that is grain, right? You have to have these cows eating grain. And so this then until really the mid 2010s is dependent on local supplies of grains. It becomes clear in the early 2000s, however, that Saudi Arabia and this massive investment in grain production is sucking the aquifers dry. There's no way that they can continue to sustain this kind of production of grains. And so the Saudis start to introduce a number of efforts to try and get the dairy companies and other producers to end the local forage production. This brings us back to Arizona. So that thriving of the dairy industry is continuing in part because they've been able to source grains from overseas. And in fact, by 2018, these companies were required to source their grain overseas. And so this process began a couple of years before, but by 2018, it was completely banned for local green fodder and forage to be used. So companies like Almarai had to figure out how they were going to feed their cows if they were going to keep their cows local, right? And I've not seen any discussion that they would try and oust the cows. The cows are staying. They can source the grain somewhere else, and so Almarai has very proudly submitted its compliance with this new requirement in various company documents. So they have gone overseas. They've gone overseas. There's one farm in Argentina, but what about Arizona? Why would they go to Arizona? Why would they buy that farm that, as I showed you already kind of incensed a number of Arizona people and critics of Saudi Arabia more generally, and their influence in the United States? Why would they go from Saudi Arabia to Arizona? A number of things. So from the push factors is the things I sort of already talked about, that they diminishing water supplies is one big piece of it. In addition to banning the forage production, they also ended a number of these subsidy regimes. And there's also kind of the sustainability story that companies in Saudi Arabia are increasingly under pressure to adopt and illustrate their compliance with new sustainability imperatives. On the other side, the Arizona side of that, the Saudis are also, in exchange for ending a number of the subsidies for the grain production, they're given instead subsidies for foreign land acquisition. And so this starts around like 2006 or so. But yeah, that's a much more complicated story that I'll leave aside for now. But basically, this pushes a number of companies to start looking, and other investors to look overseas. A number of those investments kind of go sour, they don't work out. And one of the major issues, well, several of the major issues, one is that they end up investing in land in places that are politically unstable, and so it's not clear that their investments in the land are going to be secure, or there might be an export ban from a particular country. In other cases, they might get tax incentives from a local government, but then the Saudis don't invest in the way that they want, and so there's protests and they get ousted. There's all sorts of contests around these kinds of investments. And so by this point in 2015, when this deal happens in Arizona, they've learned that it is really important to go places that are politically stable and there's going to be limited local opposition. If anybody has been to the US Southwest or knows anything about water in the US Southwest, the refrain that I heard from all sides of the story was basically, you know how messed up Arizona water law is. There's nothing we can do about this. And so this sort of gridlock around water politics in the US Southwest is actually really advantageous, right? Because it's kind of this stymied situation where nobody feels that they can do anything, even if they're against it. They don't feel like there's any possibility for opposing this kind of new use of water to grow alfalfa for cows in Saudi Arabia. So you're not getting the kind of local opposition that you would in Arizona, or that you would elsewhere in Arizona. And you're also unlikely, thanks to various US policies, to see any sort of food export ban. And most importantly, here you have access to cheap water. And this is really quite an important piece of the story, because where the farm is located is a spot in Arizona that groundwater pumping is unregulated. So basically, when the Saudis bought this farm, they could apply for permits to build a number of new wells. This is another one of those wells that they developed. You can see a kind of modern looking pumping station here. So in this part of Arizona, there's no control on how much water is being pumped, and it's very cheap. It's easy. So as long as they have the capital to build these wells, they could do so. And that is precisely what Almarai did. They applied for and received very quickly about 15 new well permits, and were able to ramp up the production. Alfalfa is something that grows very well and will give you many yields in a year, as long as it's got water. And so that's what made this particular spot appealing. I will say also about Blythe in California, the other site that Almarai owns. It's a different water regime, but it works under the similar logic, that the Colorado River water that they're pulling is quite cheap, due to, again, various regulations in that area. I think one of the dominant critiques of this farming in the Arizona case is that the land grabbing piece that I emphasize, but also the water grabbing, which is part of the same story, that most Arizonans sort of talk to me as if this is our water, our land that they are stealing. And when I say I'm talking to Arizonans, I'm talking to white settler Arizonans. These are people who understand that they may have grown up in Arizona like me. They may have felt that this is their home. But the question for me, and this whole project has led me to reflect on, is actually, whose land is this really? Whose water is this really? And one of the most fascinating parts about this particular story, in the Saudi story, is that alfalfa itself, so the grain that they're producing, that the Saudis are producing now in Arizona, was a really important tool for the US efforts to colonize the US Southwest, and in particular to recruit white settlers from the East Coast to come to settle Arizona. And you can see, this is the language that they're using, of the Southern Pacific brochure here from Southern Arizona for the Settler, which will tell you all about the riches that you can make from growing alfalfa or producing any other number of some of the pet products that they were emphasizing and trying to use to recruit settlers from the East Coast. And this was a really important project for the early boosters of Arizona and Arizona's statehood, which was only achieved in 1912. The concerns that Washington, D.C. had about Arizona and giving it even a road to statehood was that there were too many non-white residents. And so agriculture became one of the most important ways that they were trying to get people to come and to boost that white population, such that they could then sort of push toward developing and moving towards statehood. So alfalfa it was kind of described as like the king of all of the crops, and you could make all this money, this was used as a selling point from the very beginning of the efforts to colonize Arizona. So when I said, beware of the victim storyline, this is really significant, because if alfalfa is being used here in this way to take the land of indigenous populations and to take their water resources as well, whose water is it really? And those are the questions that I think get obscured again by that bigger land grab storyline. So when I'm looking at a map like this from 1928, when among the various products that they're really proudly advertising as sending across the United States, I don't see that as too completely dissimilar from this particular map from Almarai, which has been so heavily critiqued among those who are observing and critiquing the farmland acquisition. That in fact they're tied. Like you cannot understand these histories separately. This idea of alfalfa production and cattle and all of these sort of circuits, they are bound up with one another. And so just a few sort of closing remarks on how I've been thinking about this in my project on Arid Empire, and that's the name of the book that I have been working on, is that by looking at these desert to desert connections, I think we can subvert a lot of the sort of state-based conventional approaches to geopolitics. And we can also move away from those really sensational approaches to land and water and whatever food grabbing in a way that simplifies the world, but doesn't actually give us insights into what is happening and why. So I think that just by tracking some of these desert to desert connections, we can get new insights about how this works and bring our attention to other corners. And this idea of a sort of trans-regional understanding of empire, I think, is really important as well, because it not only sheds light, I think, my bigger project on how empire works, not just like the U.S. empire in the Arabian Peninsula, but also how some of those tools are then used for the sort of imperial projects of state making and internal colonization within the countries that become parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And in all of this, there's really no easy victim-villain storylines. I'm wary of anything that is going to immediately tell me that like Arizona is a victim here, right? Again, I have been trying to think this through as somebody who is the child of white settlers in Arizona. That sort of history, how do you grapple with that yourself as somebody who's speaking about this history, and what that means today? So these sort of colonial and settler colonial histories, they're completely bound up with one another, and they're not just in the past, they're in the present. And so this is one of those sort of favorite images that I have from the Cressy archives, as I mentioned, my departmental successor from the 1960s. When he went to Saudi Arabia, this is one of my favorite slides that I found of his, and he just calls it camel coke double exposure. and what I like about this, and it sort of calls me back to Rob Nixon's point about the sort of this double vision of these post-colonial pastoral, is what Nixon talks about it as. That in order to understand the post-colonial pastoral, you need to have always in focus that past and that present. And the double exposure here, Cressy's double exposure here, it may look like an error, right? I think many of us would like assume that some kind of double exposure, something went wrong with the production of the film. To me, this is not an error. This is the point, right? In order to understand Arid Empire and to understand really any of these legacies of colonialism and settler colonialism, is that you have to hold both in focus at the same time. And so it's that sort of double vision that I've been trying to understand through this project. So thank you. It was supported by lots of wonderful sponsors. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Really fascinating presentation. I want to remind the audience that if you're going to post questions, please do it in the Q&A tab. There is a chat tab and there's a Q&A tab. So if you want to go that direction. The first question is from Paul Bracken. He's asking, was electricity used to pump the Arizona water subsidized by discounts from the Hoover Dam? So I guess that conjunction of hydroelectric exploitation and agriculture.
Yeah, so the water infrastructures and the electric infrastructures in Arizona have always been completely intertwined. The Vicksburg farm is a little bit far from the Hoover Dam. So I don't know if that was the specific part of the question, but basically in the Vicksburg area, they're pumping groundwater, so aquifer water. Hoover Dam is damming the Colorado River. So there's different kinds of electrical needs and things that are going on with how that water is being allocated when it's Colorado River water versus aquifer water. So there's a bit of a difference, but in the short answer to your question is that yes, the water and the electric infrastructures have always been and continue to be deeply intertwined.
I had a question, I think, just thinking about this broader topography of the Arid Empire and what the Saudis are doing, and how, if you could comment on how the Arizona piece fits in with a lot of the other, the rest of the Saudi map. I know in Sudan, and just that's a kind of an expansive global footprint. And so maybe if you could have some comments on that, how the Saudi piece fits into that bigger picture.
Yeah, so I think you're asking about where else they're investing.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah, okay. So yes, there is a much bigger story, and I've been tempted to go look in that direction, but I've tried to keep my focus very narrowly on Arizona for a number of reasons. The primary reason is that I'm trying to understand how the desert, like as a narrative, as a technological narrative, gets used to justify these kinds of connections. So the Saudis, from various sort of sovereign wealth fund investments to other dairy companies, they are investing in places like Sudan and parts of Southeast Asia, South Asia, as I mentioned, also in Latin America. So those projects are much larger, and they also tend to not be in arid environments. In some cases they are, but the desert doesn't figure as prominently in those. So from the very beginning of this project, and when I first started asking water people in Arizona about this, their immediate reply to me was like, this is stupid. You shouldn't be investigating this. It's just a drop in the bucket of a much bigger story. There's all sorts of bigger investments out there that are more problematic, and uses it from the Arizona side. And I think you could say that from the Gulf Studies side as well, right? That the Saudis are investing in all these other places. So why are you paying attention to this particular one? So yes, I've acknowledged from the beginning and gone against the pushback on that point, precisely because I think this story about about desert expertise is something that is really important to understand how this actually gets set up in the first place, and how these particular kinds of individuals like Carl Twitchell, David Rogers, and other people within the US State Department and Aramco later, how they harness that story of the desert to set this all in motion and to develop these kinds of relations, and kinds of expertise. And that this is what then helps us get to the point where Saudis are going and investing in other parts of the world. So I don't have any like figures to give you in terms of sheer numbers and quantity of the alfalfa coming from one place versus another. But yes, it is a relatively small portion of the bigger story.
Great. Here's some more questions. This is from Joseph Baxter. How does this farming affect the Arizona economy? Is there a quid pro quo? Was the land purchased without human rights concerns?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the Arizona economy, it's relatively small. I think one of the most telling conversations I had early on actually was with a family member who kind of I think of as representing maybe rural Arizona, the way of thinking about this from the rural Arizona perspective, is that in this area, the water tables were already falling. And so a number of the farms in the area, unless they had the capital to drill deeper wells themselves, they were going to have to abandon their land. And so already this community was facing that they were going to have to abandon their land, and that people working in these sites were going to lose their jobs. And so in talking with my Arizona family member about this, he basically said, well, why would we care if it's the Saudis who are coming if they can bring the money to drill the deeper wells and we can keep our jobs? Then who cares where they're from? And so that kind of attitude, I think, is kind of goes to the question about human rights concerns. For many people in this part of the country, and across the U.S., the human rights concerns are not as relevant, if at all. They're certainly not as relevant as the economic prospects. So at the micro level, I would say that like for these people who have benefited from the continued employment and other opportunities in the area, it's had some small benefits. The other issue of that, though, is that if you continue to drain the aquifers, and like if the Saudi farm is draining all the aquifers, it's draining the aquifers for everybody else around. So this is really short-term strategy, and it's then going to have these knock-on effects for the lowering water tables in the whole area, which then, sort of just brings you back full circle. I don't know if there was another part to that question, but I hope I answered it.
Sorry, I think that got that. Here's another question from Joylyn Namey, or a comment. Who she does work on in similar questions about Jordan and Nevada, in terms of unsustainable tourism, water use, how the ethos of a destination lends itself to sustainability or not. The question asked, I have observed very little concern about extravagant water use in Las Vegas for tourism versus attitudes towards conservation and limiting visitors in places like Petra and Wadi Rum. I'm wondering if the concerns in Arizona are driven by anti-Saudi sentiment, or is it that agricultural land versus something that seems more frivolous, tourist destination like Las Vegas?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's great to hear about your work, Joylyn. The extravagant use of water, it works in lots of different sectors, as you've kind of pointed to here, right? That in fact you've got people in the urban centers who are thinking about water in a particular way, and then those farmers who are thinking about it in a different way. In the Arizona case, I would say The pushback is largely related to the anti-Saudi sentiment. So much of the reporting actually didn't even come about until there was one investigative journalist, the one who wrote for the Reveal articles, started to investigate this. But if you talk to other people in the Arizona water sphere, they kind of push it aside, and they say that it's not that big of an issue. And the reason that they do that, the reason that the Arizona water people are pushing this aside, is because they have a different kind of agenda. In a number of cases, the state legislature and other sort of leaders in this policy realm, they're not interested in conservation. They want to promote agriculture. Arizona, from the beginning, you saw some of those colonial settlement advertisements. Arizona from the beginning has really been defined by, and political power in the state has been defined by, the connections between agriculture, which depends on unsustainable water use. And so you do have some areas of Arizona that have they're called active management areas. And these are just the big cities, basically. So like Phoenix and Tucson, these are active management areas for water conservation. The rest of the state almost entirely is not part of an active management area. And in places where they've tried to develop this, there's been too much pushback and legal wrangling and other things, such that there's no real concerted effort to try and rein that in. So I think that it reflects the bigger dynamic of the relations between political and agricultural elites within the state, that is a little, it's quite different from the kind of allegiances that you would see in a place around Las Vegas or other kinds of urban based networks where they're trying to use water in a particular way. So they're different kinds of networks and different bases of political power.
I think we have time for one last question from Sagar Sadegian, who asks, are the Saudis taxpayers in the US for this project? How do import-export regulations work between Saudi Arabia and the US in this case?
So I'm not sure if I understand the first question entirely, but are they paying taxes on the
I guess
land?
is it structured? Are there any, like, you could think of other setups where there'd be a tax haven, like a free trade zone or something like that? Are they just
I
kind of
see.
full on set up within this?
To my knowledge, this is not like a free trade zone type arrangement. That they are paying taxes on this as in normal circumstances. So I think they are like any other landholder in the state of Arizona. There's not a special relationship on that account. That said, I can't really get my hands on many of the financial documents. I would love that if I could actually see what was going on here. But no, that to my knowledge and everything I've encountered, it's just that they're a normal holder. And this is something that was, again, consistently emphasized to me by the Arizona water people, who tell me to stop looking at this case. They are basically saying, look, it was an alfalfa farm before. There's nothing different now. Obviously, the difference is that they have the money to drill the deeper wells. But the other piece of that from the Arizona side, and why many people don't want to touch this issue and call out this, like, Saudi land grab, or whatever you want to call it, that the opponents to that are saying, if we touch that, if we try and open up these legal issues, then that's going to just open up a can of worms for every other farmer in the state, and nobody wants that. And so the sort of just leaving it to the side is, and regularizing that, is a way of just ensuring that the status quo continues.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. This is just the entwinement over more than 80 years between, I think most of us are really intrigued by this and surprised, and just the complications of this, the ways that you're complicating this whole idea of land grab and who the victims and who the villains are and how complicated that is. I think we're all excited about the book and look forward to seeing it come out. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I appreciate it.
And for those in the audience, next week we'll be having another one at the same time. We'll be having Susan Slimovich coming. So join us next week too. Thanks.
Bye.